My name is Vale Oxford. I'm a member of the Aspen Homeland Security Group and currently serve as the National Security Advisor at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Previously, I held positions at the Department of Homeland Security, the National Security Council, and Department of Defense. The panel today, entitled the NSC, DHS, and State, although we lost our state panelists, so it'll be mostly focused on the NSC and DHS. Using all instruments of national power, will cover several topics over the course of the discussion. You'll hear about the 2016 Nuclear Summit that will be held in DC next year, some of the activities surrounding the Syrian chemical efforts, the initiatives that have followed, what took place and also followed with the Ebola crisis, so the Global Health Initiative. We'll also be hearing from the new TSA administrator on the capabilities addressing national security and counterterrorism efforts, as well as the evolution of TSA now and into the future. And finally, you'll hear from the DHS Director of the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office, an interagency office, and its role to ensure that all instruments of our national government are coordinated to counter the nuclear threat. Moderating the discussion today is Kevin Barron. He is the Executive Director of Defense One. It's a global security news, analysis, and ideas division of the Atlantic Media Organization. Kevin has covered the military, the Pentagon, Congress, and other political issues for the Foreign Affairs Policy, National Journal, and Stars and Stripes. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and kudos to everybody for staying this long and this late and after John McCain, which is, you know, he's a great opener to have, right? That's good. So we had some of these introductions. We apologize. So Marie Harf from the State Department was going to be here. She's instead went to New York with John Kerry. And so your replacement is the far less blonde, but equally, if not more impressively knowledgeable, Peter Neffenger, who is the new TSA administrator, who's been on the job for how long now?
3 weeks today.
3 weeks, for who's counting. So
yeah, that's right.
So, you know, I tweeted on the way out here, I got to Dulles, and it was the morning flight, and there was all of one metal detector open from the entire realm, and the line was getting longer, and everyone was getting slower, and so I tweeted out, I said, you know, it'd be a little ironic if I missed my flight because of the lack of security personnel on my way to interview the TSA administrator. But to your good fortune, we made it through, and United was late as always, so. So here we are. Right. We have an interesting panel because it's a bit of a mix. I have the TSA administrator, transportation security. I've got the White House and NSC, which is covering everything from nuclear security to the Syrian chemical weapons deal to global health even. And on the far end, we have more from DHS on nuclear detection here in the United States. I think the common thread for all of you, what you do, is this idea that we've heard a lot of this week, especially from guys like Jay Johnson at DHS, that the threat has evolved and has shifted over time as the big wars have ended, as ISIS has appeared, as things like Chattanooga happen, and much more. Everyone seems to be focused on Homeland and what's happening here. And this idea of terrorism-directed threats to terrorism-inspired threats. So maybe I'd start there, and please let the audience know a little bit about what you do exactly and where you are, and we'll get into that also. But my first question, I think, is what's the version of this in the world of nuclear security or other kind of material getting into the country? Is there a worry of ISIS-inspired versions of something that serious? And I'll start with the White House, of course, with Laura Holgate.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thanks to the Aspen team for inviting me back after last year. I guess I did okay. Certainly we do look at nuclear terrorism as a major threat. And at the White House, it's my responsibility to coordinate and oversee all of the multiple US government agencies that are involved in reducing the threat of nuclear terrorism. And that comes across not only my dear partner and friend Huban in the nuclear detection realm, but also an agency, important national security agency that has gone largely unmentioned in this meeting, which is the National Nuclear Security Administration within the Department of Energy. And they really do an enormous amount of work domestically and internationally to secure and eliminate nuclear materials that could be stolen and used by terrorists. Other partners include the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, who's responsible for security in our own homeland, and as well as the State Department, not just policy-wise, but programmatically. And so we really do have a very diverse set of government entities working to address, in addition to the traditional intelligence community, defense community that we've been hearing so much from, helping address the risk that terrorists might get access to nuclear materials.
And can I interject, to do all of that, you have a staff of how many?
Well, on nuclear stuff, I have 3 people who work with me, but I have all of these great agency colleagues all over the government. So thank you for pointing out the slimness. I have a total of 6 people on my team, and we cover not only nuclear, but also biological and chemical weapons issues, and I'm sure we'll get to those in a minute. But I want to specify that when we're looking at the nuclear security side, it doesn't really matter to us what is the motivation. Is it ISIS? Is it Lone Wolf? Is it Al-Qaeda? Is it right-wing? Whatever it is. The point is that there is one major obstacle to a nuclear terrorist device, and that is access to nuclear material. The knowledge is available. It's not as hard as it should be. The delivery systems can be crude. They're not looking to put a miniaturized device on the front end of a missile that flies 3,000 miles. All they need is a fishing boat or an SUV. And so the technology demands upon a terrorist device are much lower than they are on a state device. And so the goal for us is to really focus on that material end of the question. We started a couple decades ago with 50 countries in the world that had enough nuclear material to make a weapon. Today, that's only 25. So we've had a 50% reduction in that.
Why is that so?
Because the US government, with a lot of other partners, have worked hard to remove material from countries that don't need it, weren't using it, weren't able to protect it effectively, and were willing to work with us in a cooperative manner, and often, frankly, with us and Russia, to remove materials back to where they came from, eliminate them, and now no longer a threat. And I really want to point out Ukraine is one of those countries, one of those 25 countries, that up until a couple of years ago, they had enough highly enriched uranium at a peaceful facility that if it had been stolen, it could have been used to make 1 or 2 weapons. And now they don't have that. And that facility is in eastern Ukraine, one of the cities that's going back and forth in ownership or in control. And it would be a very different world if we were waking up every morning wondering about what's going on with those 50 kilograms in Kharkiv. Now we don't have to worry about that.
So we'll go to DHS at the end here. So you mentioned all we need is enough material in a fishing boat to make it across, which has to go through your security, I assume. That they're not going to get frisked at the border.
When it was at the Coast Guard, it did.
The Coast Guard too, but into the. But talk about that. Just educate the audience a little about what does it take for a nuclear dirty bomb or any kind of incident, or what level of worry for you for something like that to happen.
So let me pull on a couple themes from what Laura said,
Sure.
and weave that into the answer. First of all, there is this constant misconception that it is either too impossible to do or too easy to do. And of course, the truth lies somewhere in between. So there are certain things that you could do with radioactive material. You don't necessarily need nuclear fissile material. It's relatively simple, relatively easy to get your hands on, which is why the entire set of instruments of government have to be brought to bear on the problem. It has to start with regulation, law, international norms, best practices, training and exercises across the realm in realistic conditions, development and deployment of the right technologies, and certainly maintaining a certain level of operational readiness, not just right here at our shores and our borders, but starting with our international partners, international regimes, bringing it all the way through. And of course, you must not forget Homeland Security, the critical element of our state and local partners. So working together as a team, and this is one place where I think you begin to see that the founders of DNDO realized and acknowledged this early on. They set us up as an interagency office. So everybody that Laura talked about has sent detailees to DNDO. In addition, the Coast Guard, CBP, TSA, everybody sends people to DNDO because they all have a stake in the mission and they all have a role to play. Now, typically when you think of a multidisciplinary team and a nerd is talking about it, you hear the goal, I want a biologist, I want a chemist and a physicist. Well, no, you won't ever hear me say that. You will hear me say that scientists and engineers working with policy analysts, systems analysts, intel analysts, active duty and retired law enforcement and military officers all have to come to bear on this incredibly challenging mission, because we could not do it if we only looked at the solution set through the soda straw of technology so does straw of law enforcement or intelligence. In fact, it is the coupling of the three. The intelligence community has an incredibly important role to play. Our well-trained law enforcement officers have a role to play. And then, of course, we have to make sure they have the right capabilities and technologies so that when Coast Guard boards a boat out at sea, they have detectors. CBP at our ports have detectors. And TSA, every last Viper team that the administrator has nuclear detection capabilities.
So, Administrator, and I'll ask all of you this, though. So what is, with your jobs, what is your greatest worry for a threat? But what also is the most likely threat you think to happen? Because those are often two different things. And we can start with you, and you don't have to stick with nuclear issues. We can go well beyond that, because you have a lot more to worry about what you're screening and what's happening.
All right, well, thanks, Kevin. And let me just start by saying thanks to the Aspen Institute for the opportunity to be here at the Security Forum. Thank you, Clark. It's been a great opportunity. And also, thanks to my great predecessor, John Pistol, for answering all the hard questions this morning about TSA. As Kevin noted, I've been on the job exactly 3 weeks today, 1 week of which has been spent here. So that may indicate the depth to which you should dive when you ask your questions. But
it doesn't get better, I just say.
I know. Let me speak just in general terms. Why is TSA up on the stage with two people talking about nuclear weapons? I think it's because we are each fundamentally counter-terrorists in our focus. We are each responsible for no-fail missions to prevent high-consequence events from happening, from harming our nation. And we do so by working very closely with a lot of partners, primarily the intelligence community to understand the nature of the threat and its vectors, but also across the government to understand what else we might learn about how those threats could reach to the consequence level. As you know, the TSA's mission, its no-fail mission, is to protect the transportation systems of this country. The direct face of TSA is, of course, the aviation security of the country. That's our direct mission. But indirectly, we work to protect the surface transportation modes, including pipelines, through federal, state, local, and private sector partners. So that said, the threats that I worry about, we know that there is still a very strong interest in the aviation sector by terrorist groups. You can look at Inspire 13 to remind yourself of that. And as has been noted in many previous panels, that threat seems to be evolving in its form. And by that I mean you're seeing more and more publishing of information about how to do it, right? Moving from internally directed attacks to inspired attacks externally. And I know we've had a lot of discussion about whether that continuum makes sense and whether that distinction makes sense. But there are inspirational types of things, and there are directed things. I'm encouraged by the fact that a lot of the actions we've been taking through our military overseas has degraded the capabilities of those groups that have specifically expressed desire to attack the aviation sector. So I think that buys us some space, but it buys us some space to continue evolving and adapting to what I think is an evolving and adapting threat. You know, enemies get votes, and the enemy that wants to attack the transportation sector watches very carefully to see what we do. So my main concern is ensuring that we remain as a counterterrorism organization, one that continually adapts and evolves to the threat, that we push that way of thinking down to the lowest, most level, to that retail end of the business that you are also familiar with, and then we do so in a way that maintains vigilance and maintains attention to that threat.
Well, you said earlier, the public face is usually, at least on the news, it's airport screeners. How much does that? How much is that part of the real balance of what TSA as an agency is actually doing for it, even just for airline security, behind the scenes versus what is seen, at that point of contact?
Well, I mean, certainly the bulk of the TSA workforce are those frontline screeners that you see at the airport. It's not the totality of what we do. I mean, that's the delivery end of the security for the aviation system, and it is only one piece of the delivery end of the security system for aviation. As you know, the security system consists of many elements. It starts when you enter your name into a passenger reservation system, and it continues as you move your way through that system in both virtual and physical ways, some very physical ways, as you know, when you get to the checkpoints. But the idea is to understand who's moving through the system as they move through the system in its entirety. The checkpoint is clearly one of the most visible aspects of that system, and it's an important aspect. It's a deterrent aspect. It is the barrier between the non-sterile and the sterile areas of the airport, so that barrier has to work effectively, and I know there's been some questions about that raised by some recent reports. And it has to be one that catches at the last minute things that you might not have caught through other elements of your system. So how you deliver that retail service is important. It needs to be done consistently. It needs to be done with due regard to the types of threats that are out there, with an understanding of what technology can tell you, how you close whatever gaps technology might leave with the humans that are there to do it, and then what do we know about people trying to break through that system. So you have to test that system on a regular basis.
Well, you all have individual threats to worry about, and talk about the difference of how you try to stop those or catch those. So, for example, if it is someone intending to do a dirty bomb attack, whether they're from a foreign country trying to make their way in or they're homegrown inspired, what's your role, and your role in stopping that from happening? Let's start at the end with Homeland.
All right. Well, first and foremost, our role is to make sure that everybody that comes to bear on the problem is operationally ready to conduct their piece of the mission. So DNDO has an interagency coordination role so that we have the right strategies, we are building together the right capabilities, maintaining the operational readiness of our workforce. So that's part one.
Readiness.
We also have the responsibility to build the detectors and deploy them with our operational partners. So we buy the systems for all our DHS partners, and working with our state and local partners, make sure they have the right equipment.
Are there enough of those around the country for your taste?
There will never be enough detectors for my taste. But that having been said, I think it would be foolhardy for us to think that everything will depend on the detector. The human element cannot be discounted. A well-trained law enforcement officer with the right equipment, acting under the right information and intelligence, is an incredibly powerful tool. And having worked very closely on the front lines with our law enforcement officers and closely with our intelligence community, I can tell you I do get 7 hours of sleep at night.
Good. So at the White House, though, nobody sleeps, right?
That's right.
No,
that's why I don't work there.
No, 7 hours sounds great. No, for me, it's I look at where the threat might start, and if we're talking about a radiological source, those are everywhere, and for good reason. They're in hospitals healing people and helping diagnostics. They're in oil feeds helping find energy. They're in airports helping review the structural integrity of the airplanes that we fly on. I mean, there is a lot of good in the world that is done by radiological sources, but they are also poorly handled in many countries. There's a whole category called orphan sources, where a company that may have procured one, used it for a while, put it in a back room, forgot about it, closed up shop, and now that source has no safe home. And so the widespread nature of that means that there's a few things that we should be doing better on the really high activity sources, the really dangerous ones, to secure them. But ultimately, we're not going to be able to secure 100% of the radiological sources. And so then the question is, how do we build partnerships and norms and capabilities internationally to help other countries deal better with their sources, to work with the International Atomic Energy Agency, to develop global guidelines and best practices for how to secure and manage those sources, how to store them safely when they've been complete, create alternative technologies that you can do those same good things with these sources that we do with these sources, but do it with some other technology that is not as dangerous or as risky or capable of being misused. And so there's a whole set of things that if to have there be fewer things that Huban's folks have to catch, and to keep them as far away from our shores as possible. But I think there's another set of things that we really need to do on the dirty bomb issue, on the radiological dispersal device. And this crowd is sophisticated enough to know that that is not the same thing as an improvised nuclear device or an actual nuclear explosion. It will not kill people, or an RDD does not kill people, unless you happen to be so close that the explosive actually harms you. The radioactivity is spread. It's a mess. It's scary. It's going to be expensive to clean up, and it could create some denial of real estate for some period of time. So I'm not suggesting it's no, never mind. It's worth all the time and effort we do to manage it. But we've got to help our people understand better that this is not an existential threat. This is a mess, and it can be managed. And that we have the knowledge of how to keep humans safe, that we have knowledge about how to clean up quickly, effectively, that we have the knowledge about how to identify where the radiation may have spread. And we need to be doing more and better of that in terms of how do we respond and be resilient to an RDD, because that, I think, is much more likely than any of the other WMD horribles that keep me up at night.
Yes.
Well, we'll talk about that because there's some WMD stuff in the news that we'll have to at least ask about. But on a dirty bomb, for example, I mean, we're all hearing about internet-inspired instructions on how to build a homemade bomb, or what we're seeing now, a lone shooter kind of scenario. Is this really a threat? I mean, is this really how high is this on the rank right now of things that are possible to something that could happen in the United States by an actor, whether they're inspired by ISIS or whoever it is?
So I'll focus you on threat has two components, right? There is a likelihood, and then there's the consequence. For the nuclear side, as long as the likelihood is not zero, and it is not zero, the consequences are so large that it overwhelms the equation. So you cannot take your eye off that ball. That is why you need to have dedicated personnel thinking of nothing else for the nation, which we do. The RAD side, the likelihood is higher. As Laura mentioned, certain consequences, the actual loss of life may be lower, but there will still be tremendous ripple effects. And I don't like to look at it just from a likelihood standpoint. In fact, Kevin, that is one of, I think, one of our greatest challenges is people in this day and age with ISIS and with cyber and so many things happening all the time, there are so many 20-meter targets that the 200-meter, the 2,000-meter targets can sometimes get forgotten. And that has to change. We cannot forget that some people need not to be distracted by the tyranny of the inbox.
Well, then go even beyond that, then to I don't know, 2,000 yards, whatever it would be. One of the things the White House is working on is the new nuclear summit coming up next year. Tell us what to expect from that. When is it happening? What's going on? The expectations from Russia and other countries to participate in the next year.
Right. So the president, when he was a candidate, announced that one of his big issues was going to be this challenge of nuclear security, nuclear material security. And in his famous speech in Prague in 2009, in April, announced that he would hold a nuclear security summit to bring global leaders together to get that high-level political attention, which is what Huban is talking about in terms of that over-horizon focus from the most powerful leaders around the world who have something to contribute to this mission. And so we held the first nuclear security summit in April of 2010. There have been two subsequent summits, and next year on March 31st, April 1st, heard it here first, of 2016 in Washington, D.C. in the Walter Washington Convention Center, we will be hosting the fourth and final nuclear security summit to essentially put the bookend on this presidential initiative. What these summits have done is not necessarily identify new things that need to be done about nuclear security. The nuclear security solution set is simple, and it has been known for decades. We've been working on it, chipping away at it. The reason the president wanted to get leaders together is he recognized that some of the things that needed to be done, still needed to be done, were politically hard, expensive, took a lot of political will, and required leadership decisions to make. And so we've seen a significant uptick in national behavior to improve nuclear security. Over half of that 25-country reduction that I mentioned earlier has happened in the last 6 years or 5 years since the first nuclear security summit. Nuclear regulations have been improved all over the world. New collaborations have been created. New detection capabilities, similar to what Huban leads for the US, have been created in countries all around the world. And there's been senior level attention to this issue. The IAEA has been its contributions to the nuclear security mission have been enhanced. The resources that they have, the guidance that they provide has been extensively improved. The UN's contribution to this mission through the UN Security Council 1540, which is one of the few Chapter 7 enforceable Security Council resolutions that requires each country to appropriately and effectively secure its material. That has been extended and built up in terms of its capability. So we've seen an enormous increase in the global effort to address nuclear security.
Will Russia attend?
We'll have to see. Russia announced Russia has been part of the nuclear security summits over the last 3 years. The host last year was the Dutch, and prior to that was the Koreans. So each host gets to set their own invitation list, but there's been nobody cut off lists. They've just been added from time to time. The Russians announced last fall that they had some concerns about how we were preparing for the summit. Normal concerns, other countries that others had and that we worked through, but that they wouldn't participate in the preparations for the summit. We have not heard anything particularly from them since on that. I keep them in touch. They're on our Sherpa email list. The Sherpas, I'm the U.S. Sherpa. That's the U.S. the bureaucrats who prepare the way for the leaders on their way to the summit. We borrowed a little lingo from our friends in Nepal. But the Sherpa community is a tight one, and we're emailing each other all the time, and so the Russians continue to be in the information flow. Whether they will choose to attend, we'll have to see.
So how confident is the White House still on Russia's nuclear security, and compare that versus the nuclear material in Ukraine and what's going on now?
Well, the good news is that there is no nuclear material in Ukraine,
Well,
so
yeah.
I'm confident.
I walked right into that.
I'm confident of that. Ukraine does have nuclear power plants,
Right.
and the forces that protect those power plants are capable of repelling the incursions. They've been trained and worked with by U.S. folks, and so we are not seeing any concerns either from the Ukrainians or, frankly, in the threat stream about that. As far as Russian nuclear security goes, I mean, everyone can improve. And we've spent 20 plus years working with the Russians. You heard some of that from Ambassador Kislyak yesterday, working very deeply and effectively with the Russians. But he's right. Russia is not the Russia of 1991 when we signed those original agreements. Russia has more resources, more capability, and the relationship that we have with them doesn't need to be as assistance-driven as it was before, and can continue to occur, however, in expert exchanges, in best practice sharing, in ongoing conversations. The U.S. and Russia signed a new agreement a couple of years ago that reestablished a much more co-equal basis for our nuclear cooperation. And we've been careful, as Dazdi Farkas mentioned yesterday, to carve out that non-proliferation relationship with Russia from the general constraints that we have placed on that relationship post-Crimea. For the first time ever, it's the Russians that have pulled back a little bit from that. Some of it was predictable. Some of it was simply an acceleration of prior trends. But we believe that there's more we could be doing. And I've talked to Ambassador Kislyak while we've been here and reminded him that our door remains open for that work.
I want to go to the audience for questions fairly soon, so get them ready and think hard. And again, we're a little disjointed with our people on stage, but a couple of news questions. So I'll stick one more for Laura, and then we'll go to Peter. But so over the weekend or in the last few days, some reports about Syria's chemical weapons again in the news. What's the White House response to the alarm that new material has been found that apparently that was not found before?
Well, I'm fortunate that General Clapper addressed this last night, so I can rely on his statement that the U.S. never believed that Syria declared its entire chemical weapons stockpile when they did their declarations in the fall and winter of 2013 that they were required to do. And we've been careful to say, when we've described the removal of 1,000 tons of chemical weapons, that those are the declared chemical weapons stockpile of the Syrians. We have never said that is the entire chemical weapons stockpile of the Syrians. So it's no news that there was some material that may have been undeclared, that there's some facilities that may have been undeclared, that there have been some munition types that were undeclared. We said that in 2014 and 2015 as we were completing the destruction process. What we've been really pleased by is the efficiency and determination of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the international organization that was established to enforce the treaty. And they have set up a novel group. There's been a lot of innovation at the OPCW around this real new challenge of how do you deal with a chemical weapons convention adherent that has used weapons and had a large stockpile coming into the treaty at this stage of the treaty development. And so one of the innovations is creating this discrepancies analysis team. And so they've been sending in inspectors to facilities in Syria, declared and otherwise, to evaluate what might be there. And they're finding new things and digging deeper each time. And so this is not a surprise. This is exactly how the treaty is designed to work. And over time, the goal would be for Syria to ultimately declare in their own declaration the things that we are finding, and then manage, to get rid of them in the fashion specified by the treaty. So that's one set of concerns. Chlorine is a different set of concerns, the ongoing attacks. So the nature of chlorine is that it is not required. It is not part of the schedule of the Chemical Weapons Convention, which means you're allowed to have it. This is a good thing for anyone who has a swimming pool, for anyone who relies upon clean water. Chlorine is actually a really important part of modernity. And so there was never any question that anyone should ban it. But there was also never any question that it's a chemical weapon. It was the first chemical weapon. That's what was used on the fields of Ypres in Belgium in World War I. It was the horror of that weapon's use that caused the Chemical Weapons Convention to ultimately be brought into force. So there's an important distinction between what's listed in the treaty as completely unacceptable to even own, and then the broader principle of the treaty is any use of any chemical as a weapon is prohibited. So there's no question about the prohibition against the way the Assad regime is using chlorine as a weapon in barrel bombs dropped from helicopters on his own people. And that the US has been calling that out. We've been working to try to manage the concerns around that through the UN. We were successful in getting a UN Security Council resolution through that explicitly expressed the view of the international community that this is abhorrent and illegal. Now we're working with Russia and the other members of the Security Council to try to develop an investigation mission on who actually used the chlorine. There's been already international missions that have identified that chlorine was used, but they were not empowered to identify the user. So this will create an international judgment of what the US already knows well. There's no one else flying helicopters in Syria apart from the Assad regime. So to us, the attribution's clear. But there's some who pretend to be confused about this. And so by getting a joint mission in to look at the evidence, to identify in a clear-eyed and unbiased way exactly where the use is coming from, that can create a deterrent. It gives us an opportunity to actually have an accountability process around that attribution.
Your answers are way better than Lisa Monaco's. That's great.
That's not good to compare me to my boss like that.
Thorough, I meant. Thorough, very thorough. That's exactly the kind of thing we should be hearing from White House officials to explain what's happening. But we'll see what the audience thinks about your answers as well. So to pivot a little bit then, pick up on that if you want. I assume you don't have any comments on Syria's chemical weapons, but you might have comments on shaping up the personnel at TSA. So you mentioned, you alluded to its own news, things like Tiger teams. You're new, you've come in, I'm sure you've been briefed enough and have your own plan. What's your plan to make it better?
Well, and what we're referring to are some covert testing results that were made public that the Inspector General of the Department conducted over the past 6 months or so that indicated a significant rate of failure. By that I mean a significant ability to get items through checkpoints that should not have gotten through checkpoints at a small handful of airports in a discrete number of tests. And so that's a problem and should not have happened. As I said before, that checkpoint is an important element of the system. If not it's not the only element of the system, but it's an important one. And so you have to address that right away because there's a public confidence piece that's important. there's a real capability piece that's important to fix, and there's also an oversight
So
confidence
where do you
piece.
start? There were recommendations that Secretary Johnson
Well, I think
mentioned.
Secretary Johnson did exactly the right thing initially, and this was before, obviously before I was nominated, but he immediately ordered an examination, and it's actually rolled into what is now called the 10-point plan, but it essentially consists of understanding exactly what the nature of the failures were. So going through every single instance of failure, meaning ability to get something through, what was it that got through, what was the manner in which it got through, what was the aspect of the system that it got through, and what was done by the agency as that thing came through. And there were a number of different types of devices and implements that made it through. So that's what, there was a Tiger team attached by the Secretary to look at that specific issue. And then once you understood the nature of the failure, then how did that happen? So you have to kind of trace it back to its endpoint, the so-called root cause analysis. And there's a well-defined way to do that. And you trace it back to its starting point. And then you determine, was this a technological issue? Was it a human issue? Was it a procedural issue? Or was it some combination of the three? And as you might suspect, you can answer yes to each of those questions in specific instances. And then you have to figure out, now what do I do about it? I have to go fix that. So from my perspective, I think to some extent, fixing that is going to be relatively straightforward. You train to the failure. We will do that over the course of the next 60 days. So by the end of September, we will have trained 43,000 or so frontline transportation security officers in specifically the natures of the failures, the ways in which procedure led to the failure and how those procedures have been changed, the things that they might be doing themselves that might be leading to the failure, and then what is the operating envelope of the machinery that you're using, the technology that you're using. It's no different from when I was in the Coast Guard. You hand somebody a patrol boat, you don't just say, go out and figure out what it does. You tell them, okay, this is the operating envelope of your equipment. Here's what you can do with it. Here's what we suggest you don't do with it because it probably isn't going to help you, and so on and so forth. And so we're doing the same thing. So that, I think, is the immediate. And then you have to test again and make sure that you got it right. I'm much more interested in sort of systemically, what does that mean? What might have been a systematic issue or a systemic issue that might have led to that, so that you don't wind up just finding yourself leading to some other failures in the future, maybe in a more critical element, another critical element of the system as well. So then what we do is we take that back, and you figure out a way to engage that frontline workforce in a way that you can begin to ask them some of those more challenging questions, as well as look at all of your approach. Again, going back to this idea, you got to be learning, adaptive, and evolving as the threat learns and adapts and evolves. So near term, fix what you can. I think we can do that, but longer term, think about what it's taught us about maybe how the system might need to be adapted.
Training is nearing completion. We could possibly see more technology, more something different.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that there's a checkpoint of the future out there somewhere that's going to look different from the checkpoint that we have today. And so some of this may help us understand what that looks like as you go forward.
As long as I can bring my water bottle, that's all I care about right now. Audience, please, questions for this great group. We'll start right here in the front on the fellows table.
I'm Brian Rodzinski. I'm a PhD student and one of the fellows. Two-part question. The first one's more to Laurel Holgate. The second one, I think everyone can chime in.
You're going to be a great journalist one day.
Yeah, great. The first part of the question is, once the security summit process winds down, do you think the architecture is in place to sustain the kind of progress that we've seen? Is it more of an education thing? Is it that there needs to be more bilateral cooperation? The cheeky way of putting it is this entire process sort of being held together by you and our European partners or not. The second part, more broadly, which maybe the detection and TSA experts can touch on, is there are certain kind of parallels to the difficulty of having to fight terrorism by securing cooperation from states like Iraq and having to sort of assure nuclear security by securing cooperation from states like South Africa, which sort of refuses to give up its HEU stockpile. Given that you have to work through states, that don't necessarily want to cooperate, what is sort of the alternative to go either around them or through them or bypass them entirely?
I'm so glad you used the word architecture. This is exactly what the nuclear security summits are about, is building the global nuclear security architecture. And it has multiple layers and multiple components. This summit being the last summit, obviously very live to the concern that the architecture, we leave behind a strengthened architecture that is able to proceed and have a broader effect without biannual meetings of leaders. That's why one of the key outcomes that we're expecting from the summit is a series of what we're calling action plans for each of the 5 major elements, institutional elements of that architecture: the United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, Interpol, the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, which is a collaborative of 80-plus countries working on those issues, and then the Global Partnership Against the Spread of Weapons and Materials of Mass Destruction, which we shorthand as the Global Partnership, which is essentially a set of funders who are providing a lot of that bilateral support that you mentioned. And so each of these has an incredibly important role in working among each other, in working with member states, and helping build the global norms, rules, regulations, behaviors that we have collectively decided are what's needed to manage this nuclear security threat going forward. So our goal is to uplift each of these institutions as a product of this summit process, to highlight steps that members will take within, as members of these organizations, recognizing that the Nuclear Security Summit is only 50-plus countries, that it cannot dictate to the almost 200 countries of the UN or the 160 countries of the IAEA, but we are all member states in those institutions, and we can arrive in our member state role and set expectations for how those institutions will strengthen themselves. We can provide assets and resources to those institutions to help them do better. And so that's part of what we're going to be doing coming out of the summit process. We also expect to see the usual cascade of what we call house gifts, which is essentially the theory: if you go to somebody's house, you bring them a gift. In this case, it is a nuclear security improvement of some nature that your country may be executing, whether it's in your own country or whether it's a cooperation with another country or another institution. Each of those has an enduring effect. If you remove material, it's gone for good. If you destroy material, it doesn't exist. But some of them require ongoing political will, resources, and so on to sustain. If you install a detector, that's not a one-time thing, that's a part of a process. And so what the hope is that we can create components of these enduring institutions that will continue to pull on these expectations of member state behavior. The International Atomic Energy Agency had its first ever nuclear security ministerial in 2013. They're going to do a second one in 2016. One of the summit outcomes, I suspect, will be to ask them to do that every 3 years. That gives you a ministerial moment, which is not the same as a presidential moment, but it's close, for countries to come together every 3 years and say, here's what I've done. Here's my homework for the last 3 years. Here's how I've done, and here's what I'm going to do going forward, and create at least some level of ongoing political pull for nuclear security behavior.
And the second question?
So let me take a slight crack at that. And one of the things that we did not talk about yet today is another responsibility that DNDO has. Although our title includes detection, we have another primary mission, and that is technical nuclear forensics. Now that is, again, a component of an intelligence community, law enforcement, and technical cut. And if we do interdict materials, if we do interdict weapons, we can attribute them. We can attribute their source. So it is the policy of the United States government to hold responsible any state sponsor, any subnational, et cetera, for aiding and abetting nuclear terrorism. So there are multiple ways, and our title is instruments. We bring multiple instruments to bear on the entire nuclear security enterprise, the full spectrum, all the way from material security, detecting it if it leaves control, attributing it once we have it, and that builds in not just the detection cycle, but a deterrence cycle as well.
Okay, we'll move on. This gentleman in the middle right here.
Alexander Rossolimo from the Center for Security and Social Progress. On the issue of nuclear terrorism, about 10 years ago, Al-Qaeda's then second command who has since been killed, claimed on Australian television that they had acquired an atomic bomb. He said, if you have $25 million, you can go to Central Asia, find a disgruntled Russian weapons scientist, and buy an atomic bomb. Now, I don't know whether he was telling the truth, but delivery would not require a sophisticated system. Just smuggling into the US on a container would do it. How do you respond to this?
Well, there have been no atomic bombs in Central Asia since 1994. So I do not take that as being a serious statement.
But how serious is the ability for any run-of-the-mill terrorist around the world to get an actual bomb?
I think that's a much lower probability than getting hold of nuclear material.
Right.
Nuclear bombs are units. They're easy to count. They're easy to secure. And if a country has them, they've spent a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of political energy getting them. So the political will to secure nuclear weapons could not be higher. And in most cases, that comes along with capability. If there's countries that wish for help in that regard, they can get it from other countries. We worked closely with Russia, again, as you heard, to help them with some of their nuclear weapons security issues and the transfer of those materials back from the other countries. Nuclear material, by contrast, is much more broadly present. It's in commercial facilities as well as military facilities. It comes in all kinds of forms, all kinds of packages. It's hard to tell if you've got, a liquid form of nuclear material, whether you're missing a cup of it. So there's a much greater accountancy challenge for the materials, and that's why I really focus on that as the biggest terrorist threat. Because if they get those materials, they don't need a Russian weapons scientist to build a bomb. They just need to look on the internet about the designs for what we used in Japan in the 40s. And so that's one of the fallacies of the nuclear terrorist equation.
May I address the notion of putting it in a container? I would like everybody to know that today, anything that comes to our shores in a container is scanned using radiation detection systems by our Customs and Border Protection personnel. So everything that comes across our Canadian and Mexican borders on trucks and in cars, scanned using radiation portal monitors. Every boarding party from the United States Coast Guard that gets on one of these ships uses radiation scanning monitors. We have TSA personnel in our transportation networks. Our state and local partners have capabilities. We are far better off today in our ability, not just with technologies, but also with training and protocols, collaborations, information sharing, than we were 10 years ago.
You guys are here. So, back of the room, the gentleman standing up.
Thank you. I'm Brian Bennett from the Los Angeles Times, and thank you all three of you for taking the time to answer our questions today. I wanted to ask a question I think each of you could have a piece of. In 2011, the administration decided to cancel the next generation development of nuclear detection portals at the ports. And that program would have been able to identify the exact isotope of radiation that was coming through. In 2014, the administration decided to cancel BioWatch after investing $61 million into it. My question is, do we still have the need for those programs and for that capability? And what are we doing to get there? And in addition, does the cancellation of those programs show that DHS is still struggling with the ability to manage these types of big thinking moonshot programs, and that Congress and DHS suffer from the attention span and the patience to execute?
So there's a lot in that question. I cannot address the BioWatch issue. I will speak to, however, the advanced spectroscopic portal issue, and then talk to you a little bit about where the department has developed over time and is going to get better based on a lot of work we are presently undertaking with leadership across the department. So first, the advanced spectroscopic portal. That was a lesson for all of us, that if you're going to build and deploy good systems, you have to work very closely with your end users, your partners. Do we still need systems of that nature? Yes, perhaps differently. So radiation portal monitors today, or maybe a year ago, went off a heck of a lot because darn near everything is radioactive. Kitty litter, bananas, granite, ceramic. They are detectors. These are not false alarms. These are nuisance alarms. Well, working with our technical community and very closely with our CBP partners, we have found a way to use the systems today with better algorithms to reduce those nuisance alarms by 75% on average. Some ports as high as 90%. This allows CBP officers to now be redirected to more critical or other critical port security issues and national security issues. So we have found a way, working very closely with our partners and end users, getting their information, using their information to design and build systems to deploy much better capability for the United States. Part one. Part two, about the department itself. We have matured as a department. We have come a long ways when it comes to discipline, when it comes to partnership. I have been at the department from day one. Take it for what it's worth. I have never seen a better team in leadership. I have to tell you, we work so well together to be able to address the larger issues serving the Secretary's Unity of Effort initiative. We now have a Joint Requirements Council. Everything that has to be purchased and bought in great quantity by the department is actively debated by the Deputies Commission, led by our Deputy Secretary. I think we're on the right path. We are still a fledgling organization in many ways, and you will have to be a little patient with us. But I think we are on the right path. You just have to work with us on it.
Okay. We had a hand on this side of the room. Oh, sorry?
What about biowatching?
BioWatch.
No, I'm sorry. I am not a BioWatch expert, and I don't want to tread on that.
What about the capability of detecting early detection for a biological weapon? Is that a capability we should have as a country?
Do we have early detection of biological weapons?
We do have BioWatch detectors. It was the next generation that was canceled. And this much I can say, our Health Affairs Office and our Science and Technology Directorate are collaborating to figure out what that next generation needs to be. So it hasn't been completely removed off the table. It's just that version of it is not presently in acquisition protocol.
Okay, there she is.
Hello, Pamela Brown, Fox News. Quick question about the monitoring of the scientists that come.
A little louder in the microphone.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
A quick question for the panel about the monitoring of scientists. Specifically, there is an Iranian scientist known as Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who appears in named as someone being sanctioned up until I think 2023. How do you confront and keep the scientific community open to share the information that you need to monitor to keep all of us safe? Thank you.
So there's a lot of layers to that. Certainly, one of the layers has to do with the degree to which they engage with American people, not just officials, but American scientists. If you're talking about American scientists overseas, they have a responsibility under what's called the deemed export requirement under export control to know and to understand what it is about their research that is available to be shared internationally, and what must be protected or licensed for transfer to somebody else. So that's a piece that governs how our experts interact internationally, but this still keeps the flow open, keeps the opportunity open for conversations. Now, if you're talking about scientists that are coming to the United States to do work in US facilities, then it depends very much on a layered set of judgments that start with a visa conversation, and then certain facilities have certain additional requirements for clearances or background checks, depending upon the nature of the work that's being done in the US facilities. I see what you're saying. You're worried about this Iranian guy going somewhere else and helping somebody else. Okay, that there are certainly concerns about that kind of behavior, and our solution sets are not really something that can be talked about in this environment.
One more from the audience for now? Well, we've covered a lot of ground.
Can I say a couple words about bio?
You can. I was going to say, I'm hoping it's about radioactive kitty litter, but I'm still hung up on that.
Well, I just wanted to mention one other initiative that we're working on that has one of the most broad whole-of-government components to it, which has been one of the themes of this conversation, and that's the President's Global Health Security Agenda. This is a recognition that the things that you need to do as a nation to be prepared for a bioterrorism event overlap significantly with the things we need to do as a nation, that any nation needs to be able to do to deal with an outbreak of other kinds of infectious diseases. And in February of 2014, we launched, along with more than 40 other countries, an effort to bring countries all around the world up to a very specific set of standard capabilities to detect, prevent, and respond to outbreaks of infectious disease of any character, naturally occurring, accidental, or terrorist type. And so we've been working with all these countries. This was before Ebola, by the way, but Ebola really proved the point. When you look at the difference between the 3 most affected countries' ability to deal with that threat, and, for example, Nigeria, who had a small outbreak but were able to contain it because they had been able to achieve many of these targets of the global health security agenda. So when I pull an interagency meeting together on that, it almost takes up this kind of a size of a room. Because not only do I have the traditional national security team with me, but I also have Health and Human Services, Centers for Disease Control, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Environmental Protection Agency, and a number of other components of the U.S. government who all have a stake in the effective management of prevention, detection, and response to infectious disease. So there'll be, the president spoke at a ministerial meeting last fall. There'll be another ministerial in September that the Koreans host. So this is another way that we're trying to develop not only a rich interagency engagement, but also a broad global engagement to address one of our top priority threats to U.S. security.
Why is that under your purview? If you're in charge, your office is weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, threat reduction. You're talking about global health. Is it the fear of using infectious disease as a weapon or weaponizing?
It's because the solution sets are so overlapping. And so I co-lead the Global Health Security Agenda with Gail Smith, who is the head of our Democratization and Development Office. USAID is another component of that I mentioned, or that I forgot to mention, as one of the unusual players. And so it's whether you're talking about lab security and not allowing pathogens to get out of a laboratory in another country and perhaps into terrorist hands, whether you're talking about a swift diagnosis that enables you to contain the threat and know quickly that it's a terrorist thing and not a natural outbreak, whether you're talking about a response capability that is not just about how do you care for the sick people, but how do you attribute and perhaps address in other ways the origins of a threat. The solution sets are not completely overlapping, but they're largely overlapping. And a lot of the resources, expertise, and relationships that we need to do that work overseas lie in the development community. And so we're channeling those to help us get at this broad problem.
Well, I feel like the Cold War panel that said it was refreshing to not talk about ISIS and cybersecurity, and they got to speak about good old-fashioned state-on-state geopolitical, death of the world kind of stuff. We've only gone through, let's see, port security, pipeline security, airlines, nuclear weapons, nuclear materials, radiological materials, and kitty litter. So you can't ask for anything better than that. How about a big round of applause and a hand for this crew? And thank you to the Aspen Institute for the forum.